Hello students, welcome to Epg Pathshala. In the paper for MA Sociology called Ecology and Society, today we are going to discuss module number 8, where we start discussing agrarian ecology. In the first part of our modules on agrarian ecology, we will discuss green revolution. This module seeks to understand the idea of the green revolution in independent India. In doing so, it will deal with the debates surrounding food security and the need for green revolution within the first 2 decades of independence. Beginning with the food shortage crisis that independent India faced in the decade following independence, which necessitated the green revolution in conjunction with other schemes to improve agriculture in India, this module will move on to decoding what the green revolution symbolizes and means. It will also pursue one of the broader narratives of the entire course, namely the ecological costs of human experimentation. The module will conclude with considering the environmental and social costs of green revolution and briefly deal with the current debates around food security in post-green revolution India. Thomas Malthus was one of the first scholars who proposed an elaborate theory on population growth. In his book, An Essay on the Principle of Population, which he wrote in 1798, Malthus proposed that populations grow exponentially, that is at a geometric rate, while food production increased only at an arithmetic rate, leading inevitably to shortage in food supply to the rising population. The conclusion Malthus draws therefore predicts a catastrophic scenario in the future where human beings would have no resources to survive upon. In remedying or averting this catastrophe, Malthus suggests checks on population growth, categorizing them as preventive or positive checks. The Malthusian proposition becomes a stark reality with the birth of independent India. Burdened not only with considerable economic, social and military turmoil, the newly independent nation also had a mammoth task in providing basic welfare measures to its population. This task also drew its importance from the fact that India had suffered a food disaster only 4 years prior to independence during the Great Bengal famine. It was estimated that nearly 3 to 4 million people died of hunger alone in Bengal provinces of the then British India, which also included Bangladesh. While it is argued that this was a man-made disaster made possible by British colonial rule, it did leave its mark as regards the potential danger of apathetic policy making and execution. It was but an obvious policy step that prompted the independent nation's policy makers to focus on food supply and in fact to do so as to increase productivity in food grain production. Primary to the concerns of welfare was the provision of food security in India's burgeoning population, essentially a task of feeding the millions. In terms of policy, this task began with a focus initially on land reforms in the immediate years of independence and stretched well into the 1950s. Focus on agriculture, minor irrigation and a decentralized approach in implementing the schemes saw its culmination in the first 5-year plan, which spanned from 1951 to 1956, which was deemed as a success by the then government. However, the ideas of modernity and emphasis on large-scale development saw the second 5-year plan from 1956 to 1961 stress on industrialization rather than agriculture, leading to a disaster in food grain production. The food grain deficiency in the country, however, came to be understood in simple economic terms as market deficits, which translated to the increasing food grain production through areas which were deemed to be capable of producing surplus. In other words, better endowed areas would produce more, which would then be procured for the market to compensate for areas with low food production. Changes in agricultural practices such as better irrigation facilities, use of advanced fertilizers and pesticides to increase crop yield and making way for high yielding varieties of crop, mainly rice and wheat, were seen as key to addressing the crisis of food supply. It is in this context that the Green Revolution transformation in agriculture occurred in India. The Green Revolution period roughly began around 1967 and went on to last almost a decade. It was prompted by the development of a new variety of high yielding seeds developed by the American scientist Dr. Norman Borlaug. Following research work in Mexico where he developed the HIV seeds, Dr. Borlaug helped in the advancement of these seeds to the third world in the mid 20th century. Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, an Indian geneticist, who worked closely with Dr. Bollag in developing these seeds to suit conditions in India, and this led to the era of Green Revolution. This period witnessed a spectacular growth in food grains production supported by an increase in irrigation facilities, use of machinery, cheap credit provided by the state, procurement of credit, etc. Considered a supremely advanced technological development, the Green Revolution was particularly hailed in India for transforming a position of food shortage to food surplus and increasing food grain production to a record 131 million tons in 1978-1979. Encouragingly promoted under the Intensive Agricultural Development Program, the HIV seeds program covered 5 crops: wheat, bajra, paddy, maize and jowar, of which the wheat crop saw record yields of 5 tons per hectare against the normal yield of about 2 tons. The above paragraph presents a one-sided narrative of the Green Revolution, which presents it as a terrific success story, a story that is without flaws and impact in the decades following it. The Green Revolution did cause significant transformation in agricultural practices in India and initially did bring success to food grain production as well. However, these transformations have led to changes in environment and society as well. Prior to dealing with these changes, this module will also seek to understand the Green Revolution as a marker of modern practices during an age in which modernization as such was the dominant development paradigm of the world. In considering this, the module will also bring into light the questions of power and seeks to understand if the Green Revolution was another discourse seeking to uphold the dominant power structure in the world. Green Revolution and the rise of modern practices. The emergence of the modern state saw the rise of various practices to make the population and the environment legible. Legibility, writes James Scott, is a central problem in statecraft. He understands the problem of legibility by drawing a comparison between the pre-modern state, which he terms as partially blind, which knew very little of its subjects, in contrast to the modern state, which is highly focused on making everything known and visible. The modern state apparatus, therefore, operates through rationalizing and standardizing what was a social hieroglyph into a legible and administratively more convenient format, making possible the regulation of society as an administrative task. The lens through which the modern state looked at its population is also precisely how it looked at the environment. Nature as such began to be organized based primarily on a utilitarian principle suited to maximize economic benefit. Scott writes, plants that are valued become crops, species that compete with them are stigmatized as pests, unquote. Thus, trees that are valued become timber, while species that compete with them become trash trees or underbush. While these quotations describe Scott's efforts at understanding scientific forestry, the same parallel can be drawn to understand the process of Green Revolution in India. India awoke to the dreams of modernity. Nehru was its archetype model. Technological innovations and scientific temper coupled with high levels of industrial growth was seen as key indicators of progress towards embracing science and the modern way of life in a nation riddled with superstitious beliefs. It was lure of the modern that prompted Nehru to once proclaim that factories, research laboratories, irrigation dams and power stations are the new temples of modern India. In the face of these transforming changes, agriculture was evidently the key indicator of the backwardness of Indian society. This very backwardness in agricultural practices was also understood as a reason for low productivity. The Green Revolution model therefore appeared as a miracle, a harbinger of progress, scientific and technological advancement, and most importantly its application in a relatively primitive enterprise, agriculture. Legibility played a key administrative tool here in identifying select areas and crops for implementation of the program for a very fulfilling of utilitarian purpose, surplus in food grain production. New practices or systems of knowledge, however, do not often function alongside existing systems. More often than not, they replace them, creating an erasure of knowledge systems. Scientific forestry, as James Scott described, did not merely provide the state apparatus means to understand the ecological systems of a forest in a given territory, but made it the only legitimate means to understand forests as such. Traditional systems of knowledge which focused on man's intimate relations to the surrounding flora and fauna came to be replaced by a legitimate and dominant state articulated by way of knowing the same environment. In the third world, the disappearance of such traditional knowledge systems took place through its interactions with West. In other words, as a result of colonialism. Vandana Shiva argues that the impact of colonialism in the third world generally leads to the emergence of a dominating and colonizing culture, which is promoted as universal. This arises out of an incredibly interplay between power and knowledge, which seeks to preserve established social hierarchies to maintain structures of dominance. The existing knowledge systems within a society are dismissed as being unscientific and primitive, which have to be replaced to benefit society. Indian agricultural practices were subject to the same tones of condemnation, and the Green Revolution was therefore looked at as truly modern innovation. The Green Revolution replaced the symbolic relationship and symbiotic relationship also between soil, water, farm animal and plants with a new variety of seeds, chemicals and machines. Traditional patterns of crop growing included rotational crop patterns. However, the single most significant impact of the Green Revolution was the introduction of monocultures. In other words, multiple cropping patterns were replaced by the growth of genetically modified uniform crop patterns. This reduced the diversity of crops grown in a field to only commercially viable cash crops. The Green Revolution therefore in a fell swoop eliminated entire varieties of seeds and crops in the world by terming some as unscientific or primitive to replacing them with the HYV variety, which definitely fetched a better price in a globally integrated capitalist market. It led to the significant loss of nutritious crops such as ragi and jowar, which were termed inferior, and also eliminated the growth of marginal crops which grew alongside major seeds such as wheat. Most of these were also a source of livelihood for the peasants of the country who used reeds and grasses which were declared as harmful to the growth of major crop and termed as weeds during Green Revolution paradigm for basket and mat making, thus fetching a subsidiary source of income. The Green Revolution was thus another knowledge systems institutionalized effectively to maintain dominance of Western scientific models, shaped to consolidate and promote commercial viability to the need of global capital. The ill impacts of Green Revolution are not merely environmental, but are in fact interlinked. The immediate impact on the soil and water has led to long-term effects on the health of the farmers and peasants, and has at the turn of the century most significantly led deep fissures in the Indian social fabric. What are the ecological costs of Green Revolution? Agriculture is nothing but a modification of natural processes in order to serve human needs. By using agro-ecosystems of soil, water and ecological services provided by other members of the biota. So, whenever mankind has tried to modify agriculture, he has basically modified natural processes or altered it altogether. That is in the case of Green Revolution. So, Green Revolution has resulted in degradation of soil systems, contamination of water and decreased biodiversity. This has resulted in unsustainability of agroecosystems, and many of those areas are now no more cultivable due to high level of toxicity and salinity of soil and water. The success of the Green Revolution came with significant ecological costs. Aside from displacing traditional systems of knowledge and even eliminating subsidiary means of livelihood to peasant families, the changes to agricultural practices during this period saw a transformation in the soil and air quality. In other words, in the ecosystem itself. The initial success and popularity of high yielding variety seeds prompted the term miracle seeds to refer to the same. However, they may be more appropriately described as high response seeds. These seeds, unlike their traditional counterparts, responded quickly to the high dosages of fertilizers sprayed and produced higher yields. So, rapid was the success of these seeds that Ludhiana witnessed a tremendous increase in the usage of the Mexican variety of wheat seeds within 1 year of Green Revolution, that is from 1967 to 1968, from 18,000 acres to 2,45,000 acres being devoted to the cultivation of wheat. These seeds were high maintenance and needed a constant supply of fertilizers, pesticides and water, apart from high amounts of credit for its upkeep. While these high yielding variety seeds did not prove much of a success with the non-wheat crops, the crop outputs in wheat managed to keep its drawback clocked. The ecological costs, on the other hand, were not latent and have led to further agrarian crisis not only in India but across the world. J.R. McNeill notes that the increased pesticide usage led to the rise of resistant pests, which in fact absorbed these doses. Pesticide usage was often also not accurate and ended up in the surrounding water systems or most effectively in the human tissue itself, thus contaminating both. The heavy fertilizer usage has also led to the eutrophication of lakes and rivers and altered the genetic diversity of agriculture. In India in particular, where crops serve a multipurpose use apart from food as fodder to animals, organic fertilizers to soils, and also as mentioned earlier to help in providing subsidiary income to the peasant family, the agricultural changes brought forth by the Green Revolution systematically altered the balance in the ecosystem itself. As Vanna Shiva notes, I quote, "The destruction of diversity and the creation of uniformity simultaneously involves the destruction of stability and the creation of vulnerability." Unquote. Most crucially, the monocultures that the Green Revolution led to are practically unsustainable. They cannot, as mentioned earlier, exist alongside indigenous or traditional crop varieties, but can only survive by replacing them completely. In a narrow mindset, utilitarian outlook, commercially viable crops which fetch a higher price in the market and can also be shown off as trophies, there is no consideration to the harmful effects on the ecosystem. Motivated by an anthropocentric view of nature, the ecosystem primarily appears as transformable or is considered to be easily molded according to human needs. While this view of scientific transformations appear as necessary and in fact normal at times, it must be kept in mind that this normal in fact represents the abnormal. These transformations have led to problems of deficiency in the nutrition capacity of the soil, problems in waterlogging and groundwater mining. Water is an essential requirement for life, which also plays an important role in agriculture. The Green Revolution was greatly dependent on water and has neither looked it as a limiting factor nor considered that the contamination would be a boomerang effect. Chemical intensive farming requires high amount of water to not only dissolve the fertilizers and pesticides, but also high yielding variety which were alien to the local environment has required high amounts of water. It has resulted in over exploitation of water resources on one hand due to high requirement, and on the other hand polluted freshwater sources due to mixing of fertilizers and pesticides. Increased water requirements due to Green Revolution has resulted into digging millions of tube wells and bore wells to exploit groundwater. The overexploitation of groundwater across the country resulted into falling groundwater levels. This has resulted deeper and deeper wells to fetch water from ground, which has multiple environmental implications. Successive governments have also taken up intensive dam building across country to divert water to unirrigated areas. The dam building has resulted in the fraction of major river systems in India and has had huge environmental impacts. Another related aspect as a consequence of the pollution in the water area is the runoff from the fields which contain high amount of fertilizers and chemical pesticides. This runoff water mixes with nearby river streams and other freshwater bodies, resulting in the eutrophication of surface water bodies. This has also led to the loss of biodiversity, change in the composition of biodiversity, invasion of alien species, and increased level of toxicity in water. It generally leads to algal blooms which reduce oxygen in water and sometimes result into bloom of toxic algal species which destroys animals, vegetative species and other biota of water. Another aspect of water system is contamination of groundwater systems. due to injection of fertilizers and pesticides into soil, which remains there for many years. Fertilizers like urea, phosphates and nitrate remain inside soil, which seeps into groundwater through soil over the years, which results into contamination of groundwater systems. The problems aggravated with the fact that water is being continuously exploited, which increases concentration of chemicals inside groundwater. The use of fertilizers is destroying water resources quantitatively as well as qualitatively. The soil system forms the base and are the most important constituents of agriculture in which a plant gets its birth. It takes nutrient from the soil system to produce food and releases them again to soil so that it can support crops. Green Revolution has transformed soil by infusing artificial chemical nutrients like urea, phosphorus, potassium in order to ensure survival of high yielding varieties. Urea, which is there to fix nitrogen, breaks down into nitrates, which is water soluble and remains in soil and water systems for a long time. It contaminates soil and results into depletion of soil productivity in the long run. The application of fertilizers may have increased nitrates and phosphates in the soil, but has had a reverse impact on micronutrients of soil, which are necessary to ensure not only yields but also nutrient content in crops. The fact that the Green Revolution largely remained focused on wheat and rice, which do not have natural capacity to fix atmospheric nitrogen, unlike other crops such as dal and chana, which do. The environmental impacts of the Green Revolution are having its most damaging consequences at the turn of the century. At the forefront of these damaging consequences are the two states of Punjab and Haryana, which were touted as the success stories during Green Revolution period. These states face significant agrarian crisis today with damaged soil quality, water shortage and a good section of farmers looking for opportunities away from agriculture. The decreased yields from agricultural farms are subject to further and higher dosage of fertilizers and chemical usage in a desperate bid to increase productivity, but to no avail. The wheat paddy monoculture systems have eliminated other crop varieties, most significantly cotton in the Sirsa and Fatehabad region of Haryana. The high growing species have started dominating the fields and resulted into extinction of low growing species, which were an important part of web sphere and resulted into loss of essential ecosystem services. It has created own need of herbicides to control unwanted growth of high yielding plants. The variety of crops in one field plays an important role in controlling various pests and avoid loss created by them, but due to decreasing varieties of crop traditional systems and crop rotation systems of pest management, this also gets abolished. It has increased demands of chemical pesticides, which have further killed many associating bacteria which were helpful in many ecological processes. Now let us talk about social costs of Green Revolution. The Green Revolution was expected to diffuse the agrarian crisis in India. However, the most profound impacts of the Green Revolution are the social disparities and the increase in inequality that it has led to amongst the agrarian population in India. In benefiting only the upper class and upper caste sections of rural population, this agrarian transformation proved most adverse to small scale farmers and landless labourers. It must be remembered here that the patterns of land distribution in India have a strong historical precedent in the land tenure systems of Zamindari, Mahalwari or Royatwari. The Green Revolution typically favoured areas where pre-existing property relations were conducive to capitalist and peasant farming. Thus, this typically meant that areas under the Mahalwari system, that is India's northwest, Punjab and Haryana, the land reforms undertaken post-independence saw mixed results. Indian democracy was built on shaky foundations and was held together by the support extended to the political order by land-owning farmers in rural India, that is middle and upper land-owning farmer. In exchange for political support, the state repaid this group by providing subsidies in farming equipment, irrigation and other agrarian infrastructure. These schemes culminating with the Green Revolution program therefore saw success in areas which were already pretty well off, in the process leaving a lot of marginal areas in dire need of state support, which was not provided. Aside from the fact that it did create regional disparities at the very level of its implementation, with only some areas selected over other, the fruits of this period too fell in a very inequitable manner. J.R. McNeill notes that, and I quote, "As a rule, though not without exceptions, the Green Revolution promoted inequality among farmers. In almost all areas where it was implemented, the Green Revolution favored farmers with better access to credit and water. In the Indian case, this meant the middle and upper land-owning farmers in the country, who incidentally also belong to the upper castes. In thus favoring this select group of farmers, the Green Revolution furthered the caste and class divisions in rural India. The introduction of high-yielding variety seeds in the market, along with the range of fertilizers and pesticides, led to virtual market monopoly. These products were expensive and thus pretty well out of reach of small farmers. In order to procure these products with the hopes of increasing productivity, rural India saw an expanding credit market. It was generally the small farmers who secured loans by often placing their assets at stake. The failure of crop inevitably led to a loss of land and property, leaving this vulnerable section of the population and further impoverished. These consequences have led to the cases of social unrest and a complete dissolution of community ties. Vandana Shiva focuses on the violence caused by Green Revolution, particularly in Punjab. Disillusionment with the centralized control of agricultural policies and commodity prices caused a rift between the farming community and the state, leading to an intensified conflict. As Shiva notes, the Green Revolution policies created an ethical vacuum where nothing is sacred and everything has a price, leading also to political conflicts over capture of state power and tensions centered on center-state relations. The most spoken about issue at the turn of the century in particular, related to agrarian crisis, was of course the issue of farmer suicides. The states of Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh and Punjab in particular report high rates of farmer suicides today. In case study of 5 states, A.R. Vasavi observed that most of the victims of farmer suicides were farmers who were attempting to make the transition to Green Revolution agriculture by modernizing farm practices. This included the procurement of HIV seeds, fertilizers, a change in irrigation techniques, etc., for which loans were procured. Most of these victims, she further notes, are small farmers and belong to the lower caste groups who resorted to these techniques in a desperate bid to rise out of poverty. Crop failures, however, inevitably led to a failure to repay loans, and these accumulated large debts ultimately culminated in suicides.